Hey, welcome to episode 79 of the Gig Life podcast. I'm your host, Stevie Taylor. Now, before we chat to Jason Bruer, I just want to let you know that you can subscribe to the Gig Life podcast. If you go to www.thegiglifepodcast.com, scroll to the bottom of that first page and click on the red button, pick your favourite podcast app and hit the subscribe button. You can even set it for automatic downloads, and that means all the episodes will get delivered directly to your app. Also, if you dig the Gig Life podcast, you can share it, tell your friends about it, post it up on your socials. The Gig Life podcast is free. You don't have to pay anything ever. But if you do find the value in the Gig Life podcast, you can donate. So you go to thegiglifepodcast.com, click on that donate button, give as little or as much as you like. Just know that any donation will go back into creating the great content for this podcast. Okay, episode 79, Jason Bruer. Here we go. My guest today is Sydney saxophonist Jason Bruer. Born and raised in Adelaide, Jason didn't start playing music till very late in his teens. He studied music at the Adelaide University at the same year as his brother and sister. That's a unique story in itself. He played around Adelaide with a small quintet, Small Hours, before joining the band Fat Time, which quickly outgrew Adelaide. So he and the band moved to Sydney. From there, Fat Time went on to win the Star Search competition, and that led to national tours with Joe Cocker, Santana, Joan Armatrading, Casey and the Sunshine Band, as well as a bunch of TV show appearances. Jason moved to London in the late 80s to give the scene a crack. That move eventually led him to play with Jules Holland, Sting, Eric Clapton, Mick Hucknall, and many more. He also played on the soundtrack to one of the greatest rom-coms of all time, 3 Weddings and a Funeral. Health issues started to take their toll on Jason in the early 2000s, and so he moved back to Sydney. These days, Jason leads his powerful sextet, Hammerhead, amongst other projects. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Jason Bruer. Cheers. All right, I think we're rolling. Jason Bruer, welcome to the Gig Life podcast.
Thank you for having me.
No worries, man. The elephant in the room, I guess, COVID-19, being a professional musician yourself, the impacts, like many, is pretty massive. So what was kind of taken away from you, basically, overnight?
Well, I mean, obviously my gig life, no pun intended,
Yeah.
but, and I think that's, like we're strange beings, musicians are strange, and we have a kind of, it's like we have a secret social life as well, which is our sort of professional gigging life, which often is quite separate to, a family social situation. Sometimes they combine, but so you not only miss out on the gigging and the enjoyment of playing music, but also the camaraderie and that sort of social element. And obviously the finances are quite big as well. So it's, I think that the hardest thing for me is not really knowing, and not just for me, everybody's like, when is it going to end?
Yeah.
We heard 3 months, then we heard 6 months, and then I heard Gladys Berejiklian saying this morning that, the social distancing measures will be in place until such time as there's a vaccine.
That's right. Yep.
And that's like, man, I mean, that's a year away. So the idea of not being able to gig, I mean, I've got, tours coming up in September with my own band and stuff that I've worked really hard on. And look, I'm no different to anybody else, and lots of great gigs coming up. over that period, not to mention the ones that I've just sort of lost. So it's weird. But look, I think, things could be worse. Like, I'm well, I'm fit, I'm healthy. I've got a beautiful family. I've got time now to do stuff and be able to look back on this and go, okay, well, during this period of adversity, I did this and I wrote these tunes and I, spent lots of time with my family, which I, as a gigging musician and with older kids, often days can go by and I don't even see my kids.
How old are your kids, Jace?
23 and 18.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and how are they coping with the social distancing? Because I mean, especially 18 to 26, 27. I mean, that's a high social time, man. That must be rough. That must be tough on you.
Yeah. No, 100%. No, that is very difficult. Look, they're both doing really well. Mm-hmm. My son's had his girlfriend here pretty much since they announced the full lockdown. She basically moved in, and then the next day they said, "Oh, it's okay if you visit your partner." So yeah, right. She'd packed all her things and moved in, and then it was like, oh, well. So anyway, she's gone back home today for a couple of days, but she'll be back. And it's difficult. I think it's harder for my daughter because she was. This is her gap year from finishing HSC, and all of her social friends were planning to do a big European trip in August. Fortunately, they hadn't paid for it or booked it.
Right.
But my son actually had. He's about to finish university, and him and his girlfriend had a 6-week European trip all paid for. And ready to go at the end of June, so that's all been cancelled. So yeah, I think it is a bit harder for them because they're in that stage of life where they're wanting to get out and do stuff. So yeah, it impacts everybody in a slightly different way, I think.
Yeah, it does. And just like I was saying to you, with my work, we're deemed essential service because we do work for the water companies and some other places, and but yeah, the impact on us has been the homeschooling. That's the most difficult.
Yeah.
Just the sheer amount of information they send us first thing in the morning. I mean, they're trying really hard. The teachers are doing a good job under the circumstances, but yeah, when you're not sitting down, the kids aren't sitting down in the classroom and actually hearing that teacher give the lesson and then having to sit down and do the work that goes with the lesson. It's basically, here, read that, and this is your lesson. You have to answer all these things, and it's tough.
That's tough. So is your partner or wife able to be at home?
Yeah, she works 3 days a week. But she's working from home. Yes, 3 of those days, and the first 2 days of the week she's home to just do that. And but yeah, she's struggling to get all her work done because obviously having to get called back to help the kids, or there'll be a technical problem, and there were some problems yesterday with the system. She couldn't upload stuff. It's hard, man.
Yeah, well, look, good luck with everything, mate.
Yeah, thanks. All right, Jace, let's talk about your music, your career, your life. So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
You're from Radelaide?
From Radelaide, indeed.
Yep, awesome. So were you born there?
Yep.
Yep, cool. And was there music in the family? Your mum and dad musicians?
Not really. They both enjoyed music. My mother was quite musical. She played a bit of piano and sang in choirs, and loved listening to music. So did my father, but they weren't musicians per se. So whilst there was music around, it wasn't, I wasn't like a a kind of early starter. You know, like I was quite old when I started playing music.
Right.
I was, I don't know how much research you've done on my kind of, you know, the early years, as it were.
Well, I know you started playing saxophone at 16.
At how old?
At age 16? 16, is that right?
No, it was much older than that. I was
really?
19.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. So really I had no, you know, I mean, I did record it for a year or something when I was 8, and
right.
I convinced my parents to buy me a drum kit when I was 14 just to let off a bit of, you know, teenage angst.
Yep.
But I think I had, you know, one lesson or something. I wasn't really serious. I wasn't a serious young kind of player at all. So it wasn't until I spent a year in London when I was 16 and turning 17 that I kind of, I mean, looking back on this, I can sort of think, well, that's where it started, because I, you know, left school. I lived in London. I was 16, 17. I was able to go and see all the bands that, you know, I loved that would never come to Australia. So I just immersed myself in the kind of London music scene, which compared to Adelaide, man, was like, it was insane. It was literally insane. It's a much overused word, but like it was insane, like going from this kind of, you know, Adelaide's a sleepy town. It still is.
Right.
You know, and you go to London in the 70s, was absolutely wild. And I wasn't playing any music, but I was working, and my dad was over there studying, took the whole family apart from my older brother, excuse me. And, you know, so I got back at the end of 1977 to discover that some of my mates were kind of a couple of people that I wasn't even sure, I didn't even really know played instruments, were kind of, you know, jamming with guys and making music. And I used to sort of go along to rehearsals and, you know, like think, well, this is pretty cool. But I still didn't, like, I didn't suddenly think, wow, I want to be a sax player, you know, like it was sort of took a bit longer than that. And then it was just like a bolt of lightning, man. Like I felt a bit lost. I went up and lived in New South Wales, up in Byron Bay, and drifted around, you know, taking far too many drugs and sleeping on people's sofas and just bumming around the place. Had a great time, but I sort of didn't have any real direction. I hadn't finished school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I got back from that little period probably towards my 19th birthday, and just suddenly thought, I want to play the saxophone.
Where did the saxophone come from? What?
Well, look, okay.
What were you listening to? Yeah, yep.
Yeah, so I remember always, like I was a big Pink Floyd fan.
Right.
And there's quite a lot of sax on Pink Floyd. So I remember thinking, one of the things I really liked about them is that they had this different texture in their sound, because sort of out of nowhere there would be this saxophone, and I used to think, wow, that's really cool, you know, because most of the stuff I listened to in those days was, you know, prog rock or, you know, Led Zeppelin or, you know, Eric Clapton or B.B. King or anyway. Yep. So then whilst I was in London, I met a guy that was a couple of years older than me, and he took me to Ronnie Scott's, and we went and saw the Bobby Hutcherson Quintet, who's a famous jazz vibraphone player. And he introduced me to John Coltrane and Weather Report. And I didn't really know what it was that I was listening to, but I know now when I look back at that, I thought, right, that is where I got this kind of, you know, germ of an idea that maybe I could play the saxophone. But it was much later that even dawned on me,
right?
You know. So compared to most people's sort of musical upbringings, I would say that mine is definitely atypical. So by the time I did actually take up the saxophone, that's all I wanted to do. Like, it was from nothing to, right, this is now what I want to do. You know, like, I've never, ever been so focused in my life, you
Awesome.
know. When I went, right, that's what I want to do, and I realised that if I practiced and became, you know, as good a player as possible, I might have a chance of auditioning as a mature age student at the University of Adelaide Bachelor of Music course. So I kind of worked out that if I practiced, you know, a lot, I might be able to achieve that goal. So I had lots of sort of part-time jobs and other jobs, but I still managed to practice, you know, 6 to 8 hours a day for 3 years. Did you I auditioned.
Did you have teachers, or were you
self-learning? Pretty much self-taught.
Right, awesome.
So I got into some shocking habits, which took a long time.
as you do when you self-teach.
That's right.
You know everything.
And so I just sort of, you know, I was possessed. You know, like, I joined this band. All these guys that I've mentioned before that were jamming sort of asked me to join their band when I'd only been playing for about 6 months. I mean, it was horrible. I listened back to those recordings and I go, God, that was just terrible. But you know, there was a lot of passion there. And anyway, cut a long story short, I got into the course, and, you know, sort of everything kind of took off from there, really.
Did you find that because you hadn't had those lessons and you were that you were self-taught, was there struggles with the lessons? Did you have, what I mean was, were there people in your class or on your course that had already been training and could already read? And
Yeah. So my sister, right, who I'm, you know, absolutely in awe of, she was the only one in our family that started music at what I consider a kind of normal age, which was 7, right? Like, I start off a lot of kids at 7 on flute or clarinet, saxophone for the ones that are a little bit bigger, but even saxophone is too big an instrument for some 7-year-olds. But
right.
a lot of my students, I start off around 7 or 8, and they kind of learn in a way that they're not even thinking about what they're doing. They just learn. They play in the band program at school, and, you know, they kind of go through life playing music.
Yep.
And some of them get better than others. Some of them stick at it. In my sister's, in the case of my sister, which is an interesting kind of scenario. So she started violin at 7, and she did it all through school. She had, you know, one of the best teachers in Adelaide, and she had a whole social group of all of her friends that were aspiring violinists. She still didn't, you know, I doubt she thought she would be a professional, but she went through all of the school bands. She got into various orchestras. She got asked to join the Adelaide Youth Orchestra. Then she got asked to join the Australian Youth Orchestra. And then she got asked to join the World Youth Orchestra.
Wow, man.
Would you believe? And then when she got to the age of 17, she'd had all of that experience. She popped out the other side like a complete monster, you know, like
right.
Unbelievable sight reader, great ears, you know, like beautiful sound. I mean, she still had work to do on her playing, but she'd had all of that experience. She decided in 1982, having just finished her HSC, to go to the Adelaide University and do a Bachelor of Music. Now, it just happened that was the same year that I enrolled, even though I'd started my musical journey only 3 years prior to that.
Right.
So we both enrolled, as well as my older brother. I think this is quite a unique story. He was a car mechanic that was also passionate about playing jazz piano. So even though he was doing his apprenticeship, he was playing piano, and then he got quite obsessed with piano, as did I on the saxophone. And he also auditioned in the same year that I did. So the three of us ended up going to Adelaide University and studying music together.
Wow. That is unique. Never heard of that before. That's awesome.
That's right. Yeah.
That must have been pretty comforting too. Because, you
know.
Yeah,
look, it was. But what I realised, going back to what you said before, like I was up against a lot of kids that were like my sister, that had just gone through school playing instruments in the band programs.
Yep.
They could sight read, like really well, much better than me. I could read a bit. Like I considering I was pretty much a self-taught musician, I had a few lessons here and there. And there was this huge pressure. So being fairly competitive, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to practice more than you and try and overcome my deficiencies in that way.
Gotcha.
So I was incredibly motivated, and it was part of my sort of competitive spirit that sort of drove me on. But it was, the main part of it was just this overwhelming desire to be the best player I could possibly be,
Mm.
And, even when I started at that course, I still probably didn't think that I was going to have a 40-year career, as I sit and speak to you now.
Okay.
That was well, it wasn't 40 years ago that I started university, but I was already doing gigs well before I started.
Right.
So anyway, look, it's, everyone's got a story.
Yeah. You mentioned by being self-taught, you develop bad habits, right?
Yeah.
Can you remember once you started uni and once you started with those teachers, what the most difficult bad habit that you had to break and that was kind of holding you back from advancing?
Yeah, look, obviously that having a teacher that takes you under his or her wing and nurtures you from a young age, you can't replace that. That is the best gift you could ever have.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned a lot of bad habits. The worst one was that I played the saxophone like an oboe. I had what was called a double embouchure, because you can't see by watching a saxophone player play their instrument that they've actually got their teeth on the top of the mouthpiece. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So the traditional embouchure for a saxophone player, and it's similar to the clarinet, is you put your teeth down on the top of the mouthpiece, and the reed, where the reed vibrates, that sits on your bottom lip, that cushions the bottom teeth. Right now, I didn't know that, so I picked up the saxophone, and because I practiced so much, I could produce a pretty good sound, and I did a ridiculous amount of work on my sound because I knew, I was obsessed, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I did have teachers, they just kind of went, "Oh man, you sound really good." So they didn't question that I was doing something so fundamentally wrong.
Right.
And then I had this teacher called Barry Duggan, who's a really great alto player. And look, he wasn't a bad teacher. He smoked a lot of my weed and played. that was, so in those days, even being at the university, your teacher could actually come to your house. Like that, there's no way you can do that now. So he would come to my house, and it was an hour's lesson, and he'd be at my house for 3 hours because he'd get so stoned, and he'd just play along to all of my records, and I would just sit there going, "Wow, I guess I better roll another joint." But listening to him play was inspiring, and he was the only one that noticed that I had this weird embouchure. So that was very difficult to undo, and I still, as a result of that, I have quite an unorthodox embouchure, I think. But look, you get around it, and a lot of people do. Even Coltrane, when he had his issues with his teeth. He had to change his embouchure quite considerably, but, there's a period in his career where you can really hear the difference in his sound because he's being challenged by the fact that he had to adjust to, whatever they did in those days with your teeth, replacements or crowns or whatever. So that, I think, obviously I missed out on all of that depth of musical study, like I explained with my sister's experience, and that her experience was sort of much more typical.
Right.
Mine was sort of atypical, but I just kind of pushed myself, and I ended up doing okay. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Were you playing in bands during that time?
Yeah, so I formed my own jazz quintet called Small Hours, and we were, we did sort of, I don't know, probably a couple of gigs a week or something, even back then before I started university. I was also in another band prior to that, which was a all original kind of art rock kind of jazz band, a band called Cottage, that was extremely inspiring, and that was sort of probably the band that gave me the most hope that I could do this, because the players in that band were so much more advanced than me, but they liked something about what I did, and we basically rehearsed 5 nights a week with that band. So you start coming to terms with your instrument more quickly than you otherwise would when you're playing that much. So I was already in a couple of bands when I got to university, and then in 1982 I was asked to join this band called Fat Time that eventually sort of outgrew the scene in Adelaide, and I instigated bringing that band up to Sydney, and that's how I got my start in Sydney.
Right. Now, I did read that about how Fat Time outgrew the Adelaide scene. Can you explain how that happens? I don't know anything about the Adelaide music scene then or now. And
yeah, look, I guess when I say outgrow, I mean, look, that maybe sounds a bit pretentious, but it just in that, we were doing all of the kind of gigs that a band like that could do. We were packing places out like everybody did in those days, because
right.
in the early 80s, people went out.
Right.
Venues were packed everywhere, same in Sydney. Mm-hmm. So we got to a sort of point where we'd sort of got to the ceiling, really.
Okay. All right.
So, like, historically, a lot of the biggest bands in Australia, some of whom came out of Adelaide, they eventually get to a point where they move. Okay. Like Little River Band and, Cold Chisel and, 2 bands that come, spring to mind. Most people that are sort of ambitious in the music world move out of Adelaide because it's a small city. So I guess that's what I mean by outgrew the scene.
Yeah, it didn't sound pretentious at all. No, definitely not.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
good,
no,
good.
Not at all. I just, like I said, it's me not knowing about the scene down there, which I'm starting to learn a little bit more about. So that's cool. You cleared that up for me. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so I actually, I was hell bent on moving to Sydney. I came up to Sydney in 1981, I think, and did this workshop by a guy called Jamie Abersold, who was an American educator. He came out and did these workshops with like the heaviest jazz players, all the A-listers, and it was like a week band camp at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. And me and my brother and a couple of my mates, we drove up from Sydney and we went enrolled in that course. I think that was 1981. And that just completely blew my mind. Going to that course during the day, going out every night, seeing what Sydney had to offer. And at that point, I knew that, I just needed to sort of become a better player. And then the first opportunity that I got, I would be out of Adelaide and up to Sydney. So I didn't actually even finish my degree. It got to the point with the band Fat Time that I thought, okay, I reckon we might be able to make a go of it in Sydney. So I actually drove up to Sydney, Gold Coast, Brisbane, and the Sunshine Coast. I think I was away for maybe 10 days and just knocking on agents' doors.
Yep.
And just sort of basically doing a recce, to sort of suss out whether that band would have a chance of getting work up here. And I got a really positive response. So I went back to Adelaide and I said to everybody, right, I reckon we'd really do well up there, so I want to take the band up to Sydney. And who's in? And most of the band went great. They put their hands up and a few didn't, and we replaced them, and pretty much that's it. I left my degree, did 2 years of my degree, and then I went, nah, I want to go. So we left. It was probably the best thing I ever did.
Right. So tell me a little bit about Sydney, and that was 1984 you moved up there?
Yeah.
Moved up here, sorry. How was the scene at that stage? What was going on?
Unbelievable.
Yep.
It was just extraordinary. I mean, it happened so fast. I'm told I had a good time in the 80s, but a lot of it I don't remember.
I've heard that once or twice.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a cliche, but I'm telling you, man, unfortunately, I've got some serious black holes in my memory.
Right.
From back in those days. But look, we got up here I know it was January 1984, and very, very shortly thereafter, I got a phone call from this agent. And I can't even remember if I'd knocked on his door when I did my recce, but there was a guy called Eric Carlini, known as Chubby. He was actually originally Adelaide, and he had this agency called the Sphere Agency. Mm-hmm. And he still does. He still operates, and he's got most of the clubs on his books. And, he rang me up and said, I can get you guys work. I've heard about you. Let me see what I can do. And we said, okay, and off we went. Before we knew it, we were working 4 or 5 nights a week. And then in a very short period of time, we were working as much as we wanted to, basically. There was just never any kind of, there was just seemingly no shortage of gigs.
Right. And you guys ended up doing some national tours with Joe Cocker and Santana, Joe Nama Trading, Casey and the Sunshine Band.
Yep. So there was this talent show at the time in 1985 called Star Search, which was kind of, I guess it was the equivalent of The Voice and The Idol and, Australia's Got Talent. It was the first one of its type. And it had, the difference was that it wasn't about singers. It wasn't just about vocalists. It was about bands, which was cool. Yep. And it was also, they had other categories as well. But anyway, we entered we got put up for it, and we went through and we ended up winning it. So that immediately kind of raised our profile because that was, national TV. And that's how we got the Santana and the Joe Cocker and the KC and the Sunshine Band. We'd supported Joe Nama Trading when we were in Adelaide, actually. So, the band had really high profile for an unsigned band. We supported a lot of the big bands of the day, like Dragon and Party Boys and the Models and the Dynamic Hypnotics, and there's probably numerous other bands that we used to support. Matt Finish, some bands that were on a much higher level than us, but we often got those support gigs.
Awesome.
And then also, as a result of that, me and the horn section often got session work with some of those pop bands. So it was exciting. It's a very exciting 4 years.
Yeah. What was it like touring with Joe Cocker?
Look, we did, I can't even remember. I know it was Sydney and Melbourne. I don't think we went to Adelaide. We might have gone to Brisbane. Look, it was very much them and us.
Oh, right,
the tour manager made it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
The tour manager made it very, very clear right from the beginning. And we provided our own transport. I think we probably provided our own accommodation as well.
Wow.
And the only thing we got was a fee and the support slot, and that was it. And that's pretty much how it was in those days.
Right.
Like, you didn't go on the road with those bands like perhaps you do now, where, you're flying around in private jets and getting put up at the Hilton and stuff like that. It's very much the support band. I mean, there was a trend there for a while where support bands actually paid to get on tours.
Yep, I've heard that.
That was something I learned when I moved to London. That record companies that had bands that they were trying to break, there was this massive competition for them to go on the road with some of the massive artists. And I was really quite shocked that I thought, oh, no, they don't get paid anything. The record company actually pay the other band to say, right, we want one of our up-and-coming bands to do that European tour. And by virtue of doing that tour, they would get seen by thousands of people and,
some paid promo.
So
yeah.
That's right. Whereas, interestingly, back in Australia in those days, I mean, look, we didn't do heaps of international supports, but the ones we did, we got paid. It wasn't a lot, but it was,
right.
It was something.
Yep. And did you record with that band?
With which band?
With your band, Fat Time?
Fat Time?
Yeah.
Look, not officially. No, we never made a CD. We got lots of great demos, like really good quality recordings, but we never did an album. We were very close to being signed on a number of occasions. A lot of the record company, people in those days were aware of us and really liked us, but we weren't. They couldn't pigeonhole us. We're a bit different, and we definitely weren't Oz rock. I remember Glenn Wheatley was a massive fan of our band, and we did some TV shows with when Farnham was on the show before the big album came out.
Yep.
When he was sort of, I guess, in his twilight, in that period, like he was a sort of pop idol in the 70s, and then he had a period of about 10 years where he was doing the RSL circuit to virtually no one. Like he was known, he was well known, but it was a sort of like, his profile wasn't that huge. And then suddenly, obviously, they had that album. He had that album, and it was just like, wow.
Whispering Jack, yeah, that's
Whispering Jack. Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
And didn't Glenn Wheatley mortgage his house to pay for that album?
It wouldn't surprise me.
Right, I might look that up and see if my facts are right there.
Yeah. I'm not sure, but look, he was a fan. I remember he actually rang me up, like when Farnham got huge, he actually rang me up and said, oh, would you, I'd like to use you guys, would you like to join John Farnham's band, like my horn section?
Great.
From my band, which was incredibly flattering. But I just said, without even flinching, I said, oh, no, I'm not really interested, because I had a successful band, even though I wasn't as successful as, John Farnham. Like it was, I was running a band that was doing 300 shows a year. And it was kind of my baby, and it just it didn't even cross my mind that it would be a good career move to sort of quit my own band to join Farnham.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah. So anyway.
When did you decide to leave Sydney for the UK?
Around September 1987.
Okay, why is that?
Well, Fat Time kind of, reached its sell-by date, and, we started to get a bit frustrated. We were touring a lot. We all still got on really well, but we got to a point, I think, where unless we got signed and got a deal and got up the next level, all we were going to do is what we were doing. And look, that was great. Like we had a good fan base, and we're a well-known band, and we played 250, 300 gigs a year. It was 5 or 6 nights a week pretty much, year in, year out.
Yep.
And it's hard to sustain that when you're sort of thinking, well, we need that record deal so we can get on to the next level. Yep. So that didn't happen, and that's okay. I don't have any regrets about that. Mm-hmm. And I think it was that time when I knew that the band was going to fold that I just thought, all right, what am I going to do? And I was extremely busy, post Fat Time. There was never any shortage of work. I was just freelancing, playing in a lot of bands. But something made me go, well, okay, I want to go now to London, where I lived as a 17-year-old, and explore London as a musician. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. Most of my friends and colleagues thought I was completely crazy because there was no reason to leave. It was the scene in Sydney in those days was just unbelievable.
Yep. Yep.
There's so many opportunities. So many of the big bands had a horn section or saxophone, and there was no reason to leave. But I've always taken risks, and, I took a risk, I guess, even trying to, be a professional musician starting quite late. I took a risk moving an 8-piece band to Sydney in 1984. I just thought, well, okay, let's see what happens. What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
Did
you have anything lined up when you got there, or you just
No, didn't know anyone.
Right. Right. No. So what did you do?
No.
What was the first thing you did?
So a friend of ours who was a big fan of our band Fat Time insisted that we looked up this lovely woman called Steph, who spent some time in Sydney and had we'd met, and she'd hung out with us a bit, but I didn't really know her that well. And I was travelling with a great friend of mine who was actually the trumpet player in Fat Time. So, I did have a friend with me. So I did, I had a close mate, and we were both kind of pumped to see what, we could learn or whatever. We had a year's ticket. The worst scenario, I guess, was we just have a year overseas and see what happened.
Yep.
So on the assistance of this friend, we arrived in London, and at some ungodly hour, we waited till about 9 o'clock, and we were at Victoria Station, and we rang her, this woman called Steph, and she already knew that we were going to be there because our mutual friend had tipped her off, and she said, "Oh, you've got to come and stay," and showed us told us the directions and how to get there, and she put us up for a couple of weeks and gave us an incredible sort of introduction to London.
Great.
So I'm always sort of indebted to her for her generosity back then, because it was quite. I remember getting on that plane and just going, "What the fuck am I doing?" It's like, me and my mate was also called Jason, great trumpet player. We sat in silence for about 3 hours. On that flight. We had a stopover in Thailand for a week, and we just sat there. And I remember looking at him just going, "Man, what are we doing?" And we kind of got into it. You know?
So was that, you say, once you got there and start getting into it, was that via sort of jam nights and just turning up to gigs and introducing yourself, that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, it happened very slowly for me. Jason, the trumpet player friend of mine, he got there was a great girl group in the 80s called the Fabulous Singlets that used to work in Sydney. And we'd both done some freelance work for those guys. And they were actually living in London and trying to get work. And they landed they had a show that they got a residency at one of the theatres on Shaftesbury Avenue in the West End, which was like a 6-month contract or something. And the trumpet player that they had then had decided to go back to Australia because he was sick of sort of waiting around, waiting for something to happen. So Jason slotted straight in within about a month of us being there to doing, 8 nights a week at the Duke of York Theatre in the West End. But they had a sax player, a great sax player called Dave Glide, who he'd be great for your podcast,
okay.
Man. Dave Glide, he toured with the Beatles in the 60s in Australia with a band called Sound Incorporated. And Dave's still playing. He plays every Sunday night at Low 301, a club in Surrey Hills. And he's probably in his mid-70s now, but he still plays great. And he was actually the incumbent saxophone player in the Fabulous Singlets at that point. So I sort of missed out on, getting that gig. So, man, it took me, I reckon, at least 6 months until I even got a gig in London. Like, it was a really slow burn. I went out to gigs pretty much every night. I didn't do jam sessions. I've never been a jammer. Like, I've never got into that.
Yep.
But I met a lot of people and ran out of money very quickly because the exchange rate was so bad in those days, and London was so expensive compared to Sydney back in the late 80s. It was just unbelievable. So whilst I think I had $10,000 or something, which at that time seemed like an incredible amount of money to go away with, but I think I'd spent it all in 3 months,
Right, sorry.
So I had to get a few menial jobs here and there, labouring and driving trucks and all sorts of weird shit that was, a bit hard to have to do that, having had such a successful career so far in Australia, you know what I mean?
Yep.
So it took quite a while. Me and the other Jason sort of advertised ourselves as a horn section in various publications, and we started getting a few calls from some bands, and we went up to the Edinburgh Festival. I went up to the Edinburgh Festival, I think, in that first year, 1988, and met a whole lot of people, and was asked to join a band, and started to sort of get work on a local level around London, probably towards the middle and latter part of 1988. And then it just sort of built from there, really. But it was nothing like a kind of, oh, great, man, yeah, I'll get you some gigs, because once I became established over there, a lot of, people that I knew from Sydney or Australia sort of came to London, and, of course, I was their point of contact.
And were you going, oh, no, I don't know I don't know of any gigs, man. Hey, I worked my ass off. You got to tough it out like I did, man.
That's it. I tell you what I did think at the time. I just remember thinking, Jesus, I wish I had something like this when I got there. You know?
Right.
Because it was tough, man. Like, it was going from, Sydney, the jump from Adelaide to Sydney in terms of the level of players, Adelaide's always produced some incredibly gifted players, but there's just far fewer of them. So then you go to this melting pot that is Sydney, which is just full of motherfuckers everywhere, and then you sort of go, wow, I've got to raise my game. And I was pretty confident, man, when I left Sydney, and then I went to London. Man, I just got knocked down again. It's just sort of like, okay. So it was like starting again, really.
Right. So when you say knocked down, do you mean because it was difficult to get into the scene? But I mean, I'm sure once you got in there, you kind of would have earned your keep.
But when I mean knocked down, I just mean in terms of like seeing the sheer number of unbelievable players.
Right. Okay.
The unique thing about British musicians, certainly compared to, say, American, is that nobody knows who they are. Like outside of Australia, nobody knows who these guys are. Everybody, talks about these young, up-and-coming American guys, and of course all of the established American musicians, but not many people kind of are aware of some of the incredible local musicians in London. So, I was going out every night and watching bands, just sort of going, wow, I've got a bit of work to do here,
Yeah.
So, but again, look, things like that, you grow as a musician, otherwise you're just going to have to kind of do something else, basically.
That's it, eh? That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, going through something like that would hold you in great stead, I reckon, for going through what you're kind of going through now.
Very resilient.
Yeah, resilience. That's it. Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of musicians are. I think that's one of our great qualities, because we're used to working in an industry that is, full of pitfalls and ups and downs and, strange politics, backstabbing, all sorts of stuff. And you get hardened to, being quite, what's the word for it? Resilient, to use that word again. Just to be, I'm sure I'm handling this current situation a lot better than some people that have a 9-to-5 job whose industry has been destroyed.
Yeah.
Who have never known anything other than having a job and getting their paycheck once a fortnight.
Right.
Whereas I've had periods in my life where I'm, in the back seat of my car trying to find loose change under the back seat so I can go and buy a loaf of bread.
Yep.
And fortunately, I haven't had too many periods in my life like that. But you tough it out. You become sort of wise with your money, and I think it keeps you in good stead to weather the storm in sort of crises like this.
Victor Rounds calls musicians cockroaches for the simple fact that whatever goes down, they're always going to come out. They're always going to come out. There could be a nuclear explosion. Cockroaches are going to come out, They're always going to...
Right.
The set resilience thing. They're always going to come back.
Great survivors. Yeah, Vic's a good friend of mine. I've got a huge amount of respect for Victor. So, yeah, very wise words.
Yeah, definitely. You ended up doing okay over there, based on some of the people that you ended up playing with. So Clapton, Sting, Mick Hucknall, B.B. King, Steve Winwood, All Saints, Bonnie Tyler, Van Morrison, Jules Holland. I mean, how did some of that stuff come about? Did you get into that session scene, first call type thing, or?
Look, definitely not first call. Okay. I got lucky, basically.
Okay.
I think, look, to a certain extent, you make your own luck. But a lot of those artists I played with when I was working with Jules Holland, like I got to know the horn players in the Jules Holland band when he started his what he calls his rhythm and blues orchestra, which he started in the early 90s. And I got to know the horn players And, occasionally the sax player would ring up and say, look, I've got a gig coming up with Jules. I can't do it. Can you cover me? And so I started doing some deps in Jules's band, and I was already working with some other artists and doing some tours into to Europe and Italy and France and Amsterdam and kind of all over the place with a blues guitarist that was quite big in those days, like nobody's ever heard of over here, but he was quite big on that kind of European blues circuit.
Yep.
So anyway, I was sort of, by the early 90s, I guess I was already out there doing stuff, playing in a few bands, making a living. Started doing some dep work in Jules Holland's band. And then the full-time gig came up, with with Jules's band. So he rang me up and asked me if I wanted to join his band, as the full-time sax player, which of course was an amazing opportunity. So some of those artists you mentioned I got to play with while I was in Jules's band, because we did albums with those guys. We did TV shows. We did special gigs, like gigs at the Albert Hall and like big outdoor gigs in Kew Gardens and stuff like that, where we would have a special guest. And, it's sort of like once you're in a band of fairly big profile like that, then other stuff starts coming along. And I'd already been doing some sessions. I'd met some people that wrote TV music, incidental music, and sort of theme tunes for TV. So I was already doing some session work. I got a couple of sessions early on with some of the A-listers, the people like Derek Watkins and Steve Sidwell, and some unbelievable players. Like I was really, really kind of petrified being in a studio with those guys, because they're doing like 3 sessions a day, like
right.
Suddenly I get a call from a fixer saying, oh yeah, we've got a session tomorrow for some, chocolate bar ad or something, and I'd be suddenly in this studio with all of these A-listers feeling a little bit out of place. But, you just kind of go, well, okay, well, I'm not going to say no to that. And, you become part of the scene, and then people that you get to know. I met this quite eccentric sax player who I can't even remember his name, but he asked me he knew all the guys in the the band Madness. So, the next thing I know, I'm being asked to do an album with Madness, and, kind of crazy shit like that I would have never dreamed of doing in my life. When I was a kind of 15-year-old sitting around at my mate's place, in Adelaide, smoking weed and listening to Eric Clapton. It never would have occurred to me in those days that one day I was going to be in a rehearsal room with him and then doing a gig, So,
yep.
There were a lot of pinch me kind of moments, working with big artists like that. And then you get, like, I suppose it's when you're, doing something like that, then somebody hears you and goes, oh, well, I heard that you just did, the Madness album, so can you play on this album? And
yeah,
it's sort of
that
word of mouth,
knock-on effect type thing.
Yeah, that's right. So look, I had some incredible experiences over there.
And you got to play on one of the greatest rom-coms of all time, 4 Weddings and a Funeral.
I did.
Right, how did that go down? And where are you in the movie for anybody that's sitting there in ISO about to watch 4 Weddings and a Funeral? If you want to listen to Jason play,
there's a okay. So the way that came about, which is it's worth kind of just filling you in, because
sure.
I was in a great band called Ronnie and the Rex that did the the sort of comedy circuit. Actually, there was a scene in London where There was essentially the comedy circuit, but they did involve music. And I was in this band called Ronnie and the Rex, and the singer in that band was also a comic. So often we'd do a gig where there'd be two or three comedians, and then it'd be the band, and they'd clear the chairs and people would dance and so forth. So it was a different scene, but it was really cool. And our bass player, he knew Richard Curtis, and none of us in the band had ever heard of Richard Curtis. And I remember him saying, we were playing at this place called Dingwalls in Camden. And he said, there's this guy, this director I know that's going to come and speak to us about possibly doing a movie. And we're all kind of going, oh, yeah. Like, we weren't that excited because we'd never heard of Richard Curtis and we didn't know anything about it. And the next thing we know, there's this guy in the dressing room sort of going, yeah, I'm looking for a band. It's a little film. Everything was little. Like, there was no kind of like, this is going to be bigger than Ben-Hur.
Yeah.
It's just like really understated. And I remember talking to him after the gig at the bar saying, tell me a bit more about this movie and, who's in it? And he sort of went, Andy McDowell and Rowan Atkinson and Hugh Grant. And I was kind of starting to go, so it's just some little movie, right? Yeah. So, and actually Hugh Grant at that stage, it's another story. Hugh Grant at that stage was just a kind of B-list actor. I actually used to play cricket. I used to play cricket in a team that was basically full of comedians and actors.
Right.
And he often played in the team that we played against.
Yep.
And, he'd done, some very minor sort of stuff at the time, but he wasn't a superstar by any means. So anyway, so we got asked to do this film. We're on this incredible set in this, unbelievable kind of stately home in the middle of some forest somewhere. And we were basically one of the bands for one of the weddings, because as you know, it's 4 weddings and a funeral.
Right.
And we ended up on the cutting room floor. You didn't see us in the film, but we all got credited, and we also tracked the film. So we went into Lansdowne Road Studios, which was one of the big studios where they did a lot of film tracking, and we tracked not all of the soundtrack because some of it was already pre-recorded, but we did some of the incidental stuff. And there was a scene where I can't remember which wedding, but there was a scene where 2 kids are playing kind of hand, scissors and rock or something under a table. And there was some kind of drama going on, and there was Smoke Gets in Your Eyes was playing, and that's me on that. Right. So there's that. Right. But there was also other parts of the soundtrack that we played on as well.
That's cool.
So yeah, no, it is pretty cool.
That's awesome. So you came back to Sydney in 2006. So what was the reason for that? Was things in London starting to sort of dwindle down, or was it you feel like
look, it's a combination of a few things, Stevie. There was a number of things that came into play. I had a bit of a kind of health meltdown in the early 2000s, and I got a kind of really nasty virus, quite topical at the moment, but it's like a glandular fever type virus.
Yep.
It just fucking destroyed me, man, basically. And it ended up kind of, manifesting in a kind of chronic fatigue type, condition.
Yeah.
So I had to stop playing, and I lost a lot of my gigs, and I just had to sort of, build my career back up again, because I just basically disappeared off the scene for quite some time. Probably took me, at least 3 years before I started to circulate again, and then it probably took me another year or two after that to start sort of feeling confident about my ability again. And, I'm happy to say that I've made a full recovery, but it really took it out of me. And, when you're sort of unable to work as much as you did, and you have to sort of start reinventing yourself, and the weather's cold, and it all got a bit much, man, to be honest. And I just kept thinking, wow, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to come out the other side. And I started questioning whether I really wanted to keep living in London,
Right.
Because it's an intense city. Like, Sydney's pretty intense, but we're so lucky here with the way Sydney is, the geography of Sydney, with all of the beaches and the harbour and the space. Compared to London, it's it's a huge difference, and it's for me then, reflecting back on that, I realised that I was probably just kind of going, well, what's the point of being here, when I'm not feeling very good? And so we made a decision that coincided with me actually feeling a lot better, like I was starting to come out the other side. But we just thought, look, let's move back to Australia and just sort of see what it's like for a year or two. Mm-hmm. We didn't sell up or anything. We just rented out our house in London and moved back here. And, within very short period of time, I just remember thinking, yeah, this is where I want to bring up my kids.
Right. So you ended up getting married over there?
Yeah.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I left, I left in 1988 with a saxophone and a backpack, and I came back in 2006 with a wife and 2 kids.
And a London mortgage.
Well, yeah, but we bought early in London, so we did
sweet.
okay there.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yes. So we got back here and never really looked back. I mean, it's a hard adjustment, going from such a massive city to a smaller city, but I've, found enough to keep me amused here. And, it's 14 years now. I can't believe it.
Right.
It's a lot of stuff's gone down in that period of time as well.
That's right. So let's talk about coming home then. Had you got yourself back into playing at that stage?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, look,
okay.
So I think it was about 2001 that I got sick, and I probably stopped gigging for about 8 months. And then but it took me a long time to get back into it. And like, there's no way I could have done any touring or anything like that, So even though I managed to still do a bit of teaching, and then I built my teaching back up and started gigging more. And I got, by the time we left, I was feeling probably about 60%. And then maybe 70, and then the remaining 30% sort of happened when I got back here. So I was, I was ready. I was ready to rock by the time we arrived back here.
Mm. Had you been kind of keeping an eye on Sydney at that stage?
Look, I was, and I was actually very concerned, to be honest.
Right.
I really I remember Googling sort of jazz gigs or something once in Sydney and seeing about 3 venues, thinking, wow, this is going to be tricky.
Right.
But look, other things were happening, and I got some teaching at the Australian Institute of Music through my brother, who still teaches there. So I was, started working there sort of, probably 2 days a week or something, and, doing gigs. And then I started putting my own projects together, and, I've been pretty busy, man, for quite a while.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about, or we can talk a lot about it if you like, Hammerhead. That's your...
Oh, good.
Yeah. So that's your main project?
Yeah. Well, that's an original band.
Original project. Yep. So when did you start that?
Look, I reckon that was 2010. I started that project with a great friend of mine and a great drummer called Duncan Archibald, which was essentially to do a kind of Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers type sort of show, playing some of those charts. And I've always loved that music, the hard bop. It was probably the music that inspired me the most to be a saxophone player. Mm-hmm. So, we did our first gig at 505. Sadly, 505's not around anymore,
yep.
But Cameron Undy gave us our first, opportunity, and we played there sporadically and, build up the following, and I started sort of writing. I realised after about maybe 3 years that we should probably record an album, and that I didn't want to just record an album doing, Art Blakey tunes, so
yep.
I sort of wrote some music for that first album. And my brother, who was in the band at the time, wrote one. And then the rest of the tunes on that album were covers. And then sort of over, probably the next 4 or 5 years, we started, getting some festival gigs, and did Wangaratta Jazz and Blues Festival and Thredbo and the Manly Jazz Festival and Capital Jazz Festival down in Canberra, and band started to, become reasonably well known. We released our first album in 2014 and got, a lot of airplay and some really good reviews. And then I just sort of started thinking, I started studying composition actually, and doing a master's. And I just sort of thought, I want to actually turn this band into an all-original band, So basically I just sort of put my head down and wrote, a whole repertoire of music that we played live, over a couple of year period. And then last year I thought the time was right to record it, and we recorded Turning Point, which was the second release, which the name, I basically called it Turning Point because it was definitely a sort of change in direction from a compositional point of view, and also changed the lineup a bit as well to suit the music that I was writing. So it was a kind of, definitely a kind of crossroads sort of scenario. Mm-hmm. But we got a lot of great press for that album, and got a whole bunch of gigs in September that I'm hoping we're going to be able to do.
Fingers crossed.
Got a tour lined up. So look, that's that band. I love that band. We're really lucky that we've been able to play at Lazy Bones. We've had a residency there now for 5 years, once a month. So that's an amazing opportunity to just to be able to keep the band happening and have somewhere to play every month is great. And we've done, lots of other gigs. We did the Sydney Con International Jazz Festival last year, and we did Manly Jazz Festival again. We went up to Queensland and did a couple of gigs, did something up in Cairns and then in Brisbane. I had a lot of high hopes for what we're going to be able to do this year. And as I said, I've got quite a few dates in the book, including a trip to Melbourne, September, October, but I think it's probably unlikely that that's going to happen. But yeah, that's sort of, I guess that's my muse at the moment, Hammerhead.
Yeah. Yep.
Certainly one of them.
Yeah. What's your writing process? Do you come up with a riff on a saxophone and then just sort of build from that, or do you sit down at a piano, or do you just have a melody in your head, put it down, write a song? How's your what's your process?
It sort of varies from song to song. I guess I kind of labor over a lot of my music. Like, it doesn't just happen immediately. I'm definitely not a prolific composer. Like, I love writing. I love the process, but I don't write every day.
Some people are just too good for their own good. That kind of thing, eh? Makes you sick.
Well, look, that's right. I need to be really inspired. I find Yeah, I find listening, the more listening I do, the more inspired I get to write. And I used to write, like I released an album, my first solo album of all my own original music in 2008, which was called As Above, So Below, which was a project that I started when I was sick back in London. Okay. One of the things I did then to sort of try and keep creative was to write. So I wrote a lot of music there. I recorded some of it. I brought lots of stuff here. I re-recorded stuff here. I went into studios here. But so that album was the culmination of about 5 years writing. And most of that I wrote on the guitar. But I don't really write at all on guitar anymore. So it's more piano and saxophone. But like I'm a self-taught piano player and guitarist. I sort of get around the piano a little bit, enough to accompany students and basically compose. Mm-hmm. I can't sort of open up some piano music and play it, like I can play chords, but I can't read sort of piano music with two hands and stuff.
Yep.
But the music that like Hammerhead is, piano, bass, drums. So the driving force in the rhythm section is piano. So I guess that's perhaps why most of the stuff I write these days is on piano. Mm-hmm. And then what I kind of do is I'll come up with something that I like on the piano, and then I'll sort of develop melodies, often with the saxophone. And, back to the piano, back to the saxophone, and then put it together. Mm. But it's sort of every tune pops out in a different way. So it's quite a hard process to explain,
No, that answers my question. Thank you.
Cool.
Cool. Who are your influences these days?
What, locally or internationally?
Let's go international, and then we can talk a bit
okay.
Local.
Well, look, I guess probably, if I had to name my favourite composer, it would probably be Wayne Shorter, who was, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was, obviously in Weather Report, but way before then he was, he had his own quartet and quintet, and I love his approach to composition. Been extremely inspired by his music over the years. There's nobody sort of internationally at the moment that I'm listening to that where I get my inspiration as a composer. Like there's plenty of stuff I listen to, but I couldn't sort of go, like I love Snarky Puppy and I listen to a lot of their stuff for a while, but I don't really write like that, There's stuff that I listen to that I guess is reasonably current that I love, but it doesn't inspire me to write, Probably the biggest influence on my composition, and certainly the most inspiring artist that I've heard in the last few years and really immersed myself in is Barney McCall, who's, Australian, who he'd be great for the show as well. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know Barney. Do you know Barney?
I don't know.
Barney is an absolute legend. He lived in New York for a long time. Unbelievable composer and piano player. So he's recorded about, I think, 12 or 13 albums under his own name now. Right. He's unbelievably prolific and really adventurous. He takes a lot of risks. And I guess in the last 5 years, if I had to name one person that was the most, has given me my most inspiration as a composer and a musician, it would be him.
Right.
He spent a lot of years in New York and he's played with a lot of heavyweights. He's been back in Melbourne now for quite a few years, I think. But he's one that whenever I hear his music, it sort of inspires me. But again, I don't try and write like him.
Yep.
But it's interesting how you hear really good crafted music and really interesting contemporary music, whatever kind of genre, that can often be the spark for a composition that's completely different.
Yeah.
You know, it's quite hard to explain. Like I've never kind of gone, well, I want to sound like that band. Like I want to write a tune that sounds like that band. Like, you know, I've always sort of tried to just follow my heart when I'm writing and just sort of bring in as many kind of influences as possible. And then, you know, obviously an album like Turning Point, of course, it's still got a huge, its roots are hugely from the hard bop jazz, you know, era that started in the late 50s. But I think it's a much more contemporary kind of retelling of that music. You know, brought in a lot of influences that are kind of much more current, I think, than from back there. But, you know, in essence, that's what Hammerhead is. It's a sort of, you know, it's a contemporary hard bop kind of jazz band, I guess, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, so.
When did you get rid of your mullet? I saw some photos. You didn't know that was coming, eh?
Oh, man.
I was looking at some photos, man, and I kind of saw a few of the as it was starting to evolve over the years, and then it started getting a little bit out of. When was it?
I kind of knew. You know what?
Sorry, I'll find some photos of the mullet, and it's one of the best mullets I've ever seen. So I'll put some photos in the show notes somehow so you can check it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
pretty
cool.
pretty mean.
Look, I mean, look, that was just a thing in those days. You're a bit younger than me, Stevie, so you probably never had a mullet.
I did.
Oh, you did?
I'll tell you what.
Okay.
I'll find your mullet photo, and I'll find my mullet photo, and I'll put it in the show notes. There you go. Yep.
Perfect.
When I first moved to Australia, oh man, I had a kick-ass mullet because my hair naturally is very curly, so it took me a while to get my mullet to kind of come down onto my shoulders, you know. Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about yours.
Pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Well, look, I receded from a fairly young age, so a lot of those photos that you would have seen, I was probably in my mid-20s. And I kind of think I knew at the time that when it got to a certain point, it would all come off.
Yep.
So, you know, I did the sort of pull it back and tie it back kind of routine, sort of late 80s. And then in 91, when I met my wife, I knew it was time. And I said, sweetheart,
it's time.
you might not like this, but I want to shave my head. And what's more, you're going to do it. She said, what do you mean you're going to do it? And I said, well, I'm not going to do it. Like, I can't shave my own head. So we both got in the bath. And that was it.
Oh, the old mullet. All right. Now, your music. You've got music for sale. You've got physical copies. You've got downloads for sale. And, you know, in these times, it's, you know, everybody knows that artists don't make a heck of a lot of money off streaming. So what I'm trying to encourage people to do is buy physical copies or buy downloads, because then that a lot of that money goes towards the artists, and in this time it's very helpful. So can we talk a little bit about where people can get your music from, and I'll also link that in the show notes of the episode.
Yeah, look, that's very kind of you, Stevie, because it is important. Like so many people, especially the younger generation, just assume that you're going to give your music away, and it costs. I mean, apart from the amount of time it takes to produce an album, that it's quite expensive. So the best thing somebody could do is buy one of my albums from my website, basically, because it means every cent goes to me. So you can get hard copy, or you can get a download for, I think I've got 5 albums up there.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the most recent one is Turning Point. And you can get, I can't remember how much it is. I think it's $15 for hard copy, and $5 postage, or it's $15 for the whole album download. And if you buy the hard copy, you get the download for free.
Awesome.
So it's
awesome.
It's pretty good. Both Hammerhead albums are up there. My solo album, As Above, So Below, which I produced in 2008, or released and produced, that's up there. Plus another one called Searching for a Cool Basement. And there might be another one up there. I can't remember. But yeah, that's the best place to go.
Yeah,
JasonBruer.com.
JasonBruer.com. And that's Bruer. Yep. Bruer is Bruer and Jason Jason.
That's it.
And again, I'll link that in the show notes so we can check that out.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
No worries. So we knew you had some gigs coming up. Hopefully the ones from September and onwards still come about. What about next year? Do you kind of think years ahead for your career?
Look, I mean, to a certain extent you have to. In the jazz world, with a band like Hammerhead, some festivals that you want to get on the books, to have a chance at some festivals, they book so far out, you know.
Yep.
Now, about this time, like I had about 7 dates in the book with Hammerhead, September, October, and I wanted to try and get another 5. So I was hoping to do a 12-date tour around that time. Now, I've just dropped ball because I've thought, well, I've spent so much energy doing that, getting the ones that are in place already. The chances are venues, festivals aren't going to be booking anything until they know what's happening.
Yeah.
So to think further ahead than even this time next year is just pointless at the moment. Like I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but I think. It wouldn't surprise me if our sector, like live music, won't reappear until a vaccine has come about, which they're talking about a year's time. So it may be, autumn 2021 before we're out there gigging again, man. I mean, it's a horrendous thought, but listening to what Gladys Berejiklian had to say this morning when she said social distancing will be a thing until a vaccine is found, I thought, well, social distancing means you're not going to be able to go out to a club. Like, they might relax it slightly where you can have a couple of people round for dinner, but are they going to let clubs open and bars and pubs? I don't know, man. I really hope I'm wrong, but it's impossible as an artist to look ahead at the moment. And that's, look, in some ways it means I can relax.
yeah. To a point though, I suppose.
Which for me is a good thing, because I don't relax very easily. Like I'm not uptight, but I like to keep things moving, and I'm always sort of thinking of the next thing,
yep.
And at the moment, you just can't. You just have to go, well, all right, let's tough this one out and see everybody on the other side, So, yeah, very hard.
Well, Jason Bruer, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, man. We did have this lined up for you to be here in my studio to do this, and we had this set a couple of months ago. So it's a shame we're doing it cyberspace. I hope you like my tinfoil hat, and I love the gold llama suit you're wearing. Yeah, you're looking great, man. You just imagine if you had that mullet, though.
Well, look, I could grow it just for you.
Yeah.
I've got plenty of time to grow another mullet.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person on the other side of this COVID thing.
Yeah, likewise, man. Likewise.
Yeah, you look after yourself, man, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show.
No worries, Jason.
Okay.
Right, see you, man.
All the best,
Cheers.
mate.
You too.
See ya. Bye.